Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another tutorial. Now in this video we're going to be talking about presets. Now before we get into it, I just want to remind you what a preset is, because I find that a lot of people think that a preset, once you stick it onto any image, it's just done. But that's just not the case with presets, so keep that in mind throughout this video. Presets essentially are a starting point. Even if it's the finished edit of one photo, if you apply it to another photo, there's always going to be values you're going to have to change depending on the lighting situation, the colors of the new photo, and so on. So with that said, what we're going to be doing is saving out this preset that we've been building here over the course of this workshop. So we've got all of our color data basically filled out here on the right side, and we want to save this as an overall preset. So we're going to come over here to presets, and we're going to hit this little plus icon. Now when you hit this icon, you're going to be met with three options: create preset, import, or manage. Now import is where you can import .xmp files that you might have downloaded from somewhere or other presets. Manage is basically going to allow you to just manage these folders and basically turn on and off specific presets. Lightroom has a lot of default presets that are already installed within Lightroom that you can turn off within manage, which I already did. And lastly, now we're gonna create our preset. So we're gonna hit create preset, and you'll be met with this screen here. So at the top, we're gonna call this Lightroom Workshop, and under group, we're gonna go to new group, and we're gonna call this Lightroom _ workshop, and we're gonna hit create. So this is essentially just telling Lightroom we're gonna be saving it under this name, under this group, and it will appear here. So underneath that we have our auto settings. Now normally I keep this unchecked, but what this will do is essentially if you check auto settings, it's going to uncheck all of these and basically tell Lightroom that when we apply this preset, you are going to automatically go through and apply your own adjustments to these values that are grayed out. But this is something we don't necessarily want. The auto feature in Lightroom is pretty good, but I find that it does miss sometimes and it kind of over brightens an image. But what we're going to do is just leave this unchecked because we want a preset that is fully created with our values. So we're going to be leaving everything checked for our basic preset. Now you can go in and uncheck a few things. For example, if you plan on doing things like sharpening on your own per image or adding effects, I tend to keep effects unchecked because I like to add my grain and my post-processing after I bring it back into Lightroom from Photoshop. So that's just my workflow. But you can also come in here, and if you have any lens corrections, you can check that, or you can maybe decide things that you don't want checked. So an example of things that you probably wouldn't want checked would be the exposure. Now the reason for this is, say you have an exposure set at 0.88 here, it's going to apply that exposure to all of these images, like every image that you apply this preset to. If you uncheck it, it's basically telling Lightroom that we're going to apply all the settings except exposure, so exposure will stay at 0.0 for all the images. And personally, I think that's the best option because some images are underexposed, some are overexposed, and for sake of time, when you're kind of like scrolling through a bunch of presets, they're like eventually when you really get into this, you'll have hundreds of presets saved on the side here, and you're scrolling through them just to see a quick preview of how it's going to affect your image. I tend to not want exposure value in there because you can actually adjust the exposure and then go through and preview your images so the exposure is already correct for that image. So for the sake, we're going to leave it unexposed, and if you have my presets, you'll also know that I don't have exposure data in any of those for that exact reason. So we're going to hit create preset, and it will create our preset right here. Now say you want to create a modifier for this preset. Maybe you have a version where you want to flatten it even more, maybe something like this, bring down the whites, bring up the exposure, and maybe you have a version that's more flat like this, and you want to save, but you don't want to necessarily go over all these, save like a whole separate preset. Maybe you just want to, you have your basic preset and then you have an adjustment underneath it which you can click through to kind of just adjust specific values. So how do we do that? We're going to come back up to our plus icon here, and we're going to hit create preset. Now it's already got our group selected, so what we're going to do is say we're going to call this LR, since we're starting with LR, we're going to call this LR _ flatten. because basically what we did is we took the highlights out and the shadows out and just flattened the colors, the contrast on our image. So we're now going to come down here to check none, and we're going to manually select what we want to be adjusted. So we did our shadows, we're going to check shadows. We did our whites, so we're going to check our white clipping and our highlights. And we're going to hit create. So now we have our modifier. So now what does this do? If we click on our Lightroom workshop, and then we'll just bring this back down to 88, bring it up to about there, and then we scroll over flatten, what it's going to do is give you a preview of just if you had changed these specific settings. So you can go into a lot more detail with this. So I've even created tools here where I've turned on and off my grain. So really quickly I can click on grain and that will add it to my image. And I can see what it looks like and then just turn it off. And this just saves me time from having to scroll through all these settings and try and find grain and then, apply the right looking grain. This is just a nice grain and you can just throw it on there, turn it off. Same thing with noise reduction. If you want it a little bit smoother, you can just hit noise reduction. I also have one, so I'll just show you what these are doing. You can have one that just gives it a little more noise reduction. You can have some sharpening, which just adds some sharpening to your photo, vignetting, and using this technique that we just did with the flatten. So if say you wanted to create something like this, what we would do, we'll just turn our grain off. Actually, we'll turn grain on. And we'll just go create preset. We would uncheck these, check our effects, uncheck vignetting, because all we want to do is save our grain. And we would just call this Lightroom_grain and create. So now we have grain, and now of course you want your grain to be off, right? So what we would do is we have our grain. So if we click on our workshop, and our workshop actually has grain involved. So let's actually cut the grain off of this. And we're going to right click here and update with current settings. Okay, so we're just going to update it with current settings, check all. We don't want this, we don't want this, and it looks good. Take off exposure and update. So now we can go here and hit grain and it will just apply the grain setting. Now we can also put our grain back to 0 and then we can create a new preset. Check none, check our grain, and we'll call this, put back in our group here, Lightroom Workshop, we'll call this LR_grain off and create. So now you've got your modifiers where you can essentially turn grain on and off on your images quickly without having to scroll through them. And using this formula, you can create different sort of effects and modifiers, as they're called, to just add sort of specific tints or color spectrums to your image, whether you want to make minor changes in the HSL sliders or make a version that might warm your image up or cool it off. You can kind of have all of that control within your presets on the side here. So really, really useful sort of editing tip there. Definitely recommend giving it a try and seeing what you can come up with. But that is essentially it for this video, guys. Again, we just went over presets, so pretty straightforward, and I will catch you in the next one.